On the 23rd of March, 1994, Donald Eugene Miller ceased to exist. He did not die in a hospital. He did not suffer an accident. He was not the victim of any crime. He simply ceased to exist in the official records of the state of Ohio, United States. A judge signed an order declaring him legally dead, and with that signature, a living man became a bureaucratic ghost. The story of how a human being can be erased from official existence while still breathing is a story about the limits of the system, about the cracks in the administrative machinery that governs our lives, about the fragility of something we take for granted, our legal identity. Donald Miller was born in 1950 in Arcadia, Ohio, a small rural community in Hancock County, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where families have lived for generations, where changes occur slowly and traditions are firmly maintained. It was a place of farms and cornfields, Methodist churches and Sunday picnics, predictable lives following patterns established decades earlier. Miller grew up like any other boy of his generation in rural Ohio. He went to the local school, worked on farms during the summers, married young as was customary in that time and place. His wife was named Robin, and together they had 2 daughters, born in the early 1970s. But something was not working in Donald Miller's life. Something that official records cannot capture, something that escapes the categories of government forms. At some point in the 1970s, Miller began to fall apart. The versions of what happened vary depending on who tells them. Some speak of problems with alcohol. Others mention financial difficulties, the pressures of supporting a family in a rural economy that was beginning to deteriorate. Others simply say he was not made for the life he had built, that there was something inside him that did not fit with the role of husband, father, responsible citizen. What is certain is that in 1986, Donald Miller disappeared. It was not a dramatic disappearance. There was no farewell note, no final scene, no explanations. One day he was there, and the next day he was not. He left Arcadia, leaving behind his wife, his 2 daughters, the entire life he had built over more than 3 decades. Robin Miller, his wife, suddenly found herself alone with 2 teenagers to raise, without a husband, and not knowing whether he was alive or dead. In the rural communities of Ohio, this type of abandonment was a silent scandal. The kind of thing people talked about in whispers, but never mentioned directly. Robin had to rebuild her life from scratch, facing not only the practical loss of a partner, but also the social stigma of having been abandoned. The years passed. 1986 became 1987, then 1988, then 1989. There was no news of Donald Miller. There were no phone calls, no letters, no signs of life from anywhere in the country. For all practical purposes, he had vanished from the face of the earth. At some point during those years of silence, Robin Miller made a decision. She could not continue living in legal limbo, married to a man who might be dead, unable to move on with her life. She needed certainty, even if that certainty had to be manufactured by the legal system in the absence of verifiable facts. In Ohio, as in most American states, there is a legal procedure to declare a missing person dead after a specified period. The logic is simple. If someone disappears completely for years, if there is no contact, no evidence of activity, no sign of life, The law allows the assumption that the person has died. This allows family members to close the chapter, inherit property, remarry, move on with their lives. Robin Miller initiated this procedure. She filed the necessary documentation, testified that her husband had been absent for years without any contact, explained that she had made reasonable efforts to locate him without success. The Hancock County Court reviewed the case and on March 23, 1994, issued an order declaring Donald Eugene Miller legally dead. With that order, Donald Miller ceased to exist as a legal entity. His Social Security number was marked as belonging to a deceased person. His driver's license was canceled. Any bank account, any property record, any link to the system was suspended. For the United States government, for the state of Ohio, for all official purposes, Donald Miller was dead. Robin was able to move on. She eventually remarried, rebuilt her life, raised her daughters to adulthood. Donald Miller's daughters grew up knowing that their father had abandoned them and that, legally at least, he was dead. There is no record of how much pain this situation caused, how many unanswered questions hung in the air of that shattered family. And meanwhile, Donald Miller was still alive. He was not dead. He had never been dead. He was living in another state under the same name, working, existing, breathing. He had made no effort to hide his identity or to conceal himself from the authorities. He had simply left and had not returned. During the years following his death declaration, Miller lived what was apparently an ordinary life. He worked, paid taxes under his supposedly deactivated Social Security number, interacted with the system in ways that in theory should have revealed that the man declared dead in Ohio was still very much alive. But no one noticed. The databases did not communicate with each other the way they should have. The verification systems failed to detect the obvious contradiction. A dead man who was still working, still paying taxes, still existing in another state's records. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Donald Miller case, and one that deserves deep reflection. We live in an era that we are told is defined by total surveillance, by interconnected databases, by systems that track every move we make. And yet, a man was able to exist for years, as alive in one system while being registered as dead in another, and no one connected the dots. The cracks in the system are wider than we want to admit. The bureaucracy that governs our lives is more fragmented, more prone to error, more easily circumvented than the architects of those systems would like to acknowledge. Donald Miller was not a sophisticated criminal trying to evade the law. He was simply a man who had left, and the system was unable to maintain a coherent picture of his existence. Years passed. The 1994 death declaration became an established fact, a piece of data in the Hancock County archives that no one had reason to question. Robin Miller continued with her life. Donald Miller's daughters matured, formed their own families, processed their father's abandonment in whatever ways they could. And then, in 2005, Donald Miller reappeared. It was not a dramatic reappearance, not a movie scene where the dead man returns to claim what is his. It was something much more mundane, much more bureaucratic, much stranger in its own way. Miller had a problem. He needed to apply for Social Security benefits, the retirement benefits that every American citizen is entitled to after decades of work. But when he tried to make the application, he encountered an unexpected obstacle. According to government records, he was dead. He could not collect benefits because he legally did not exist. He could not renew his driver's license because dead people do not drive. And he could not open bank accounts. He could not sign contracts. He could not do any of the things that living people routinely do, because for the system, he had ceased to exist 11 years earlier. It was then that Donald Miller made the decision to try to legally resurrect. He hired a lawyer and filed a petition with the same Hancock County Court that had declared him dead in 1994. The petition was simple in its premise. I am alive. I have always been alive. The death declaration was an error based on incomplete information. Please correct the records. It seemed like a reasonable request. After all, the evidence that he was alive was irrefutable. There he was, standing, breathing, able to testify before the court. There is no more compelling proof of life than the physical presence of the supposed deceased. But the legal system does not work in such simple ways. The case came before Judge Alan Davis of the Hancock County Domestic Relations Court. What should have been a bureaucratic formality, a simple correction of records, became something much more complicated. The problem was Robin Miller, the ex-wife who had requested the original death declaration. She opposed her ex-husband's legal resurrection. The reasons for her opposition were understandable from a human perspective, although complicated from a legal one. When Donald Miller was declared dead, Robin was no longer obligated to pay child support that had been agreed upon in earlier legal proceedings. If Donald came back to legal life, those obligations might resurrect as well. There were financial implications, legal complications, a tangle of consequences extending in multiple directions. But there was something deeper, too. After nearly 2 decades of building a life based on the premise that her ex-husband was dead, was Robin Miller obligated to accept his return to legal existence? Was the system obligated to undo a decision it had made based on the best information available at the time? Judge Davis found himself facing a dilemma with no clear precedents. On one hand, he had a living man before him, asking to be recognized as such. On the other hand, he had a legal system that had issued a final decision years ago, a decision that had had real consequences for real people. The technical problem was the statute of limitations. In Ohio, as in many states, there are time limits for appealing judicial decisions. The 1994 death declaration had not been appealed within the period allowed by law, which in Ohio was 3 years. By 2005, 11 years had passed. Technically, the period for correcting the error had expired long ago. On October 9, 2013, Judge Davis issued his decision. It was a decision that would capture the attention of media outlets around the world, not for its legal complexity, but for its apparent absurdity. The judge rejected Donald Miller's petition to be declared legally alive. The logic was cold, technical, bureaucratic. The statute of limitations had expired. There was no legal basis for reversing the 1994 decision. However much common sense said that a living man should be recognized as living, the law said otherwise. In Judge Davis's own words, "I don't know where that leaves you, but you're still deceased as far as the law is concerned. I don't have the power to undo the order. There's no legal basis for me to do it." Donald Miller left the courthouse that day as he had entered, legally dead. The only difference was that now he had official confirmation that the system had no intention of correcting its error, He was trapped in a bureaucratic limbo from which there was no apparent escape. The story of Donald Miller became international news. Newspapers and television programs around the world reported on the man who could not prove he was alive. It was one of those stories that seemed too absurd to be true, the kind of anecdote people tell at parties as an example of bureaucratic madness. But behind the sensationalist headlines was a much more disturbing reality. Donald Miller was not just a funny anecdote. He was a human being trapped in a situation that most of us cannot even imagine. Without legal status, Miller could not do many of the things that citizens take for granted. He could not legally drive. He could not work formally without creating contradictions in employment verification systems. He could not access medical services covered by insurance. He could not vote, could not travel internationally, could not participate in society in the ways that define modern citizenship. He was a man without a country, not because he had renounced his nationality or because he had been exiled, but because the system had decided he did not exist. And once the system makes that decision, it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The interviews Miller gave after the court ruling reveal a man resigned, but not completely defeated, and he spoke about the mistakes he had made decades earlier, about the abandonment of his family that had initiated this entire chain of events. He expressed regret, but also a kind of fatalism about his situation. "I know I made mistakes," he said in an interview. "I know I wasn't a good father or a good husband, but I'm still alive. I'm still here. And the system says I don't exist." There was something profoundly disturbing about watching a man argue for his own existence. Something that challenged the basic notions we have about the relationship between the individual and the state, between reality and the documents that supposedly represent it. In theory, official documents should reflect reality. Birth certificates record births that occurred. Death certificates record deaths that occurred. Driver's licenses identify people who exist and who have demonstrated the ability to operate vehicles. But the Donald Miller case revealed something we prefer not to acknowledge, that the relationship between documents and reality can break down, that the system can create its own version of the truth, a version that does not need to correspond with verifiable facts, that a person can exist physically while not existing bureaucratically, and that bureaucratic existence is, in many ways, the one that really matters. Without a valid Social Security number, Donald Miller was effectively a non-person. He could walk the streets, talk to people, do all the things that human beings do. But he could not participate in the systems that define modern life in America. He was like a ghost who had forgotten he was dead, or more precisely, like a living person the system had decided to treat as dead. The years following the 2013 ruling are less documented. Donald Miller gradually faded from media coverage, as happens with most stories once initial interest passes. The newspapers that had enthusiastically reported his case moved on to other stories, other scandals, other bureaucratic absurdities. But the question remains, what happened to Donald Miller after the cameras turned off? The traces he left in public records after 2013 are sparse and difficult to interpret. There are no follow-up reports documenting how he lived the following years, how he managed without legal status, how he navigated a system that officially considered him dead. There are indications that he continued living in the same area where he had been before the court case. There are references to him in some local documents, fragmentary mentions suggesting a continued but marginal existence. But there is no clear narrative, no comprehensive record of the years that followed. What we do know is that at some point in the following years, Donald Miller disappeared again. Not in the way he had disappeared in 1986, leaving behind a family and a life. This time it was different. This time it was more complete, more absolute, harder to trace. The people who had followed his case report that he simply became unlocatable. The addresses that were known became invalid. The phone numbers stopped working. The contacts he had maintained stopped hearing from him. For a man who was already legally dead, physically disappearing was relatively easy. There were no alerts to trigger, no systems to notify. When someone who officially does not exist stops appearing, who notices? What database records the absence of someone who was not registered as present? The circumstances of this second disappearance are a mystery. There are no police reports, no official investigations, no record of anyone reporting his absence. A man whom the system had considered dead since 1994 simply stopped manifesting in the spaces where he had previously been visible. Did Donald Miller die? Did he really die this time? Not on paper, but in physical reality. It is possible. He was a man in his 60s when he disappeared the second time, an age when mortality begins to make its presence felt. Without access to regular medical care, without the support systems most citizens take for granted, the conditions for a solitary and undocumented death were present. But it is also possible that he simply left, as he did in 1986. That he decided to start over somewhere else, abandoning even the semi-existence he had maintained in Ohio. For someone who had already experienced disappearance once, the process was probably familiar, almost routine. The difference is that this time there was no family to leave behind, no wife who would eventually request a death declaration, no daughters who would grow up wondering what had become of their father. This time, Donald Miller disappeared into a void he himself had created, a space where his absence would leave no official mark. And that is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. The first time Donald Miller disappeared, at least there were consequences. There was a shattered family. There were legal proceedings. There was a record of his absence. But the second time, there was nothing. The system that had declared him dead decades earlier simply absorbed his absence without any acknowledgement, without any marginal note, without any attempt to reconcile reality with documents. For the state of Ohio, Donald Miller had died on March 23, 1994. Nothing that had happened since, neither his reappearance in 2005, nor his court case in 2013, nor his second disappearance in the following years, had changed that official fact. The records remained unaltered, imperturbable, indifferent to the movements of a man the system had decided did not exist. This raises profound questions about the nature of identity in the modern era. What does it mean to exist when your existence depends on a bureaucratic system recognizing it? What does it mean to die when death is an administrative category, as much as a biological fact? What does it mean to disappear when your presence was never officially registered in the first place? Donald Miller lived for at least part of his life in what we might call a state of administrative death. He was biologically alive, but bureaucratically dead. He could breathe, walk, talk, think, but he could not vote, work legally, drive, travel, or do any of the things that define citizen participation in modern society. This state of administrative death is more common than we want to admit. There are thousands of people in the United States and around the world who live in some version of this situation. People whose documents do not reflect their reality. People the system has forgotten or excluded. People who exist on the margins of official society. Some are undocumented. People who never obtained the papers that would legitimize their presence. Others are victims of bureaucratic errors, like Miller. People whose records contain incorrect information that no one has corrected. Others are simply marginalized, people who have fallen so far from the registration and verification systems that their existence has become officially invisible. For all of them, life is a series of obstacles that most citizens never face. Every interaction with the official system, every form to fill out, every document to present, becomes a test of existence that many cannot pass. They are ghosts in the machine, physical presences without bureaucratic correlates. The Donald Miller case is extreme in its details, but not unique in its essence. But what makes it particularly disturbing is that his administrative death was a judicial decision, a deliberate act of the legal system based on established procedures. It was not a typo or a filing confusion. It was the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function, producing a result that any reasonable person would recognize as absurd. The judge who declared Miller dead in 1994 made no error. He followed established procedures, applied the law as written, made a decision based on available evidence. The judge who rejected his resurrection in 2013 also made no error. He applied the statute of limitations as codified, recognized that he had no legal authority to do what Miller was asking. In both cases, the system worked, and in both cases, the result was profoundly unjust. This forces us to ask about the relationship between legality and justice, between following the rules and doing what is right. The legal system is designed to produce predictable results, to apply the same rules to all cases, to eliminate arbitrariness from judicial decisions. But sometimes, the consistent application of rules produces results that violate the most basic sense of what is fair. Donald Miller was alive. That was a verifiable, observable, undeniable fact. And yet, the legal system said he was dead. And when he protested, the system said it had no authority to change that determination. The rules were correctly applied, and the result was an evident injustice. What does this say about our legal systems? What does it say about the faith we place in the institutions that govern our lives? What does it say about the ability of those institutions to adapt to situations that were not anticipated when the rules were written? There are no easy answers to these questions. The Donald Miller case is a reminder that the systems we create to order society have limits, blind spots, areas where reality escapes the categories we have constructed to contain it. But beyond the philosophical questions, there is the practical question: what really happened to Donald Miller? The last verifiable information about him dates from the years immediately following the 2013 case. After that, the records become fragmentary, the sources dry up, the trail goes cold. Some journalists who tried to follow up on the case report finding dead ends. The addresses they had were no longer valid. The contacts they had interviewed had lost communication with him. It was as if, having failed to legally resurrect, Miller had decided to complete his death in other ways. There are theories about what might have happened. Some are prosaic. Perhaps he simply moved. Perhaps he found a way to live on the margins of the official system. Perhaps he died of natural causes without anyone documenting it. Others are more speculative. Perhaps he assumed a new identity. Perhaps he left the country. Perhaps he sought places where his legal status did not matter. But none of these theories can be verified. Donald Miller, the man who could not prove he was alive, eventually became impossible to locate. The absence that had characterized his legal death became a physical absence, a disappearance that no one had the capacity or motivation to investigate. For the official system, nothing had changed. Donald Eugene Miller remained dead since 1994. His death certificate remained in the Hancock County archives. His Social Security number remained marked as belonging to a deceased person. Any attempt to use that number to claim that identity would produce the same result: error, deceased person, transaction denied. It is a peculiar form of immortality, if it can be called that. Donald Miller's administrative death is permanent, in a way that physical death is not always. Bodies decompose, graves are forgotten, memories fade. But bureaucratic records persist. Somewhere in an Ohio state archive, probably digitized now, preserved on redundant servers and backups, there exists a document that declares Donald Eugene Miller died on March 23, 1994. That document will outlive everyone who knew Donald Miller. It will outlive his daughters, his grandchildren, if he had any, anyone who could have a living memory of him. In 100 years, when no one walking on earth has ever known Donald Miller, that document will still exist, declaring with all the authority of the state that a man died on a specific date. And that declaration will be false. It was always false. But it will continue to be official. There is something deeply unsettling about this persistence of the incorrect. We like to think that truth eventually prevails, that errors are corrected, that systems have self-correcting mechanisms that eventually align records with reality. The Donald Miller case demonstrates that this is not always true. Sometimes errors solidify. Sometimes lies become official facts. Sometimes the system is incapable of correcting itself, even when the need for correction is obvious to any outside observer. This should concern us more than it does. We live in an era where we depend increasingly on bureaucratic systems to define who we are. Our identities are increasingly mediated by documents, by numbers, by records in databases. When those systems fail, when they produce results that do not correspond with reality, the consequences can be devastating for individuals caught in the cracks. Donald Miller was not the first person declared dead by error, and he certainly will not be the last. Cases of erroneous administrative death occur with surprising frequency, though they rarely receive the media attention Miller's case received. They are errors hidden in the shadows of the system, affecting people who often lack the resources to fight against them. For many of these cases, eventual resolution is possible. With enough time, enough money, enough legal assistance, most people can eventually correct errors in their records. It is a painful, frustrating, often expensive process, but generally feasible. What made the Miller case exceptional was the judicial refusal of correction. It was not just a bureaucratic error requiring paperwork to fix. It was an error that the system actively refused to correct, citing legal technicalities that prioritized procedural consistency over substantive justice. That refusal transformed what should have been a bureaucratic anecdote into something deeper, a demonstration of the limits of the legal system to recognize and respond to reality when that reality contradicts its own records. The concept of legal death has a long and complex history in Western law. It originally arose as a way to resolve practical problems when people disappeared without a trace, a situation that was much more common in eras before modern communications. Imagine the 19th century, when a sailor could depart on a voyage lasting years, when letters took months to cross oceans, when it was perfectly possible to completely lose contact with someone simply because they had moved to another city. In that context, the ability to declare a missing person dead was a practical necessity. Widows needed to be able to remarry. Heirs needed to be able to claim property. Businesses needed to be able to close accounts. Presumptive death laws developed to meet these needs. They established time periods, generally between 5 and 7 years, after which a missing person could be legally declared dead. The logic was statistical. After so long without any contact, the probability that the person was dead was high enough to justify treating them as such. But these laws were designed for a world where complete disappearance was plausible, where a person could genuinely be lost without a trace, where absence of contact was reasonable evidence of death. The modern world is different. We have instant communication systems that make it almost impossible to completely disconnect. We have databases that track movements, transactions, interactions. We have technology that, in theory, should make the very premise of presumptive death obsolete. And yet the laws persist. The procedures continue to exist. And cases like Donald Miller's demonstrate that it is still possible to be declared dead while alive, even in an era of constant digital surveillance. What has changed is the nature of the consequences. In the 19th century, being declared dead by error was primarily a property and marriage problem. In the 21st century, it is a complete existential problem. Our participation in almost every aspect of modern life depends on the system recognizing us as existing. Without that recognition, we become non-persons. Donald Miller experienced this firsthand. He could not legally work because employers verify Social Security number status. He could not drive because licenses require identity verification. He could not access health services covered by insurance because insurances verify that beneficiaries are alive. Every system that interconnected with official records closed its doors to him. It was as if the death declaration had created a kind of bureaucratic force field around him, repelling any attempt to participate normally in society. He could exist physically, but he could not exist institutionally. This raises questions about what kind of existence is really possible on the margins of institutions. In theory, one can live without official documents. There are people who do it by choice or necessity. But that life is severely limited, confined to the interstices of official society, dependent on the informal economy and the goodwill of others. For someone like Donald Miller, who had lived his entire life as a documented citizen, the transition to official non-existence must have been particularly difficult. He was not prepared to live on the margins. He did not have the skills or connections that allow some people to navigate the informal economy. He was simply an ordinary man, trapped in an extraordinary situation. The years between 2013 and his final disappearance must have been extraordinarily difficult. Without the ability to work legally, how did he support himself? Without access to formal medical care, how did he manage his health as he aged? Without the ability to participate in the normal transactions of daily life, how did he solve the thousand small problems we all face? There are no documented answers to these questions. The journalists who covered his case focused on the dramatic aspect, the legal absurdity, the spectacle of a man arguing for his own existence before a court. Few were interested in the follow-up, in the mundane realities of living as an officially dead person. What we know is fragmentary. There are indications that he received help from people who sympathized with his situation. There are suggestions that he found ways to work informally, outside the employment verification system. There are vague reports of a marginal but continued existence somewhere in the Ohio area. But eventually, even those fragments of information ceased. Donald Miller, who was already hard to trace, became impossible to find. The second disappearance was more complete than the first, perhaps because this time there was no system that could record his absence. When someone who officially does not exist stops appearing, who notices? What alarms are triggered? What procedures are followed? The answer, in the case of Donald Miller, seems to be none. His final disappearance occurred in the most complete silence, without police reports, without official searches, without any institutional acknowledgement that something had changed. It is possible that he is dead. It is possible that he died alone, somewhere no one knew him, with no one to claim his body or report his absence. In that case, his physical death would have finally aligned with his administrative death, though no one would have documented it. But it is also possible that he is still alive. He would be over 70 now, an advanced age, but not impossible. He could be living somewhere, perhaps under a different name, perhaps in some community where official documents matter less, perhaps simply keeping a profile low enough to generate no detectable trace. There is no way to know which of these possibilities is true. And that uncertainty is, in some way, the most appropriate ending for this story. A man whose existence was questioned by the system ended up disappearing in a way that makes it impossible to determine whether he continues to exist or not. The questions his case raises have no easy answers. How should legal systems handle cases where reality contradicts official records? What rights do people declared dead by error have? How do we balance the need for procedural consistency with the need for substantive justice? The Donald Miller case did not answer any of these questions. It left them floating in the air, uncomfortable and unresolved, like Miller's own status. There is something profoundly human in Donald Miller's story, something that transcends legal technicalities and bureaucratic absurdities. It is the story of a man who made mistakes, who abandoned his family, who fled his responsibilities. He was not a saint or an innocent victim. His own actions, his own decision to disappear in 1986, created the conditions for everything that followed. But it is also the story of how a system can trap a person in consequences disproportionate to their original mistakes. Miller abandoned his family, yes, but did he deserve to be erased from existence for that? Was it fair that his irresponsibility from decades ago transformed into a permanent sentence of non-existence? The legal system does not consider these questions of equity. It applies rules, follows procedures, produces results. Whether those results are just or not is not a question the system is designed to answer. Miller tried to play by the rules. He hired a lawyer, filed a petition, argued his case before a court. He did everything the system says a person should do when they have a grievance. And he lost, not because his grievance was not legitimate, but because the rule said it was too late to correct it. There is something Kafkaesque about this situation. A man trapped in a bureaucratic labyrinth, following procedures that lead nowhere, facing a logic that makes internal sense, but produces absurd results when confronted with reality. Kafka wrote about characters who cannot understand the rules of the system that governs them, who do not know what crime they have committed, who cannot find the court that judges them. Miller knew exactly what rules had condemned him, could see the judge rejecting his petition, perfectly understood the logic that kept him dead. And still he could do nothing about it. It is a particularly cruel form of powerlessness, because it is completely transparent. There is no conspiracy, no malice, no villain working against him. There is only a system following its own rules, producing results that no one wants, but no one can change. This powerlessness before impersonal systems is perhaps the defining characteristic of modern life. We all experience it to some degree. The frustration of dealing with bureaucracies, the sense that rules are arbitrary but inviolable, the awareness that we are small before institutional machines that surpass us in scale and persistence. Donald Miller experienced this powerlessness in its most extreme form. He was crushed by a system that was not evil, just indifferent. He was a victim not of people, but of procedures. His life was destroyed not by enemies, but by rules. And when the system was done with him, when the cameras turned off, and the journalists moved on to other stories, he disappeared. Not dramatically, not like a movie ending, but simply ceasing to be present, ceasing to generate the data that would indicate his continued existence. The silence he left behind is total. There is no way to know if that silence is the peace of death, or simply the stillness of a life lived completely outside the registration systems. Both possibilities are consistent with the absence of information, and that uncertainty, that impossibility of knowing, is perhaps the most eloquent statement about the relationship between individuals and the systems that govern them. We live in an age of data, of records, of constant surveillance. And yet, a person can disappear so completely that we cannot even know if they are still alive. This should be impossible. In a world of interconnected databases, of algorithms that track movements, of systems that supposedly know everything about everyone, a complete disappearance should not be possible. But Donald Miller demonstrated that it is. He demonstrated that the cracks in the system are wide enough for a person to fall through them and leave no detectable trace. He demonstrated, ultimately, that the surveillance we feel so oppressive, the systems that seem so omnipresent, are less complete than we believe. There are spaces between databases. There are moments where systems do not communicate. There are people who can exist without being recorded. This is disturbing because it undermines our faith in the systems that supposedly protect us. If someone can disappear so completely, what else are those systems failing to detect? If records can be so fundamentally wrong, what other lies are they proclaiming as truths? But it is also, strangely, comforting. It demonstrates that total surveillance is a myth, that there are spaces of freedom even in a bureaucratized society, that people retain some capacity to escape the systems that classify and control them. Donald Miller found that freedom in the worst possible way, forced into it by a system that had declared him non-existent. But he found it. He demonstrated that it is possible to exist outside of records, although that existence is difficult and marginal. And then he disappeared into that freedom, losing himself in the spaces between systems, becoming truly invisible in the way the documents had falsely proclaimed decades before. His story has no definitive ending. It lacks the satisfaction of resolution, the clarity of a conclusion. It has only the ambiguity of an unanswered question, the uncertainty of an unknown fate. Where is Donald Miller? Is he alive or dead? Did he find some form of peace? Or did his life end in the same marginality that had characterized his last known years? We do not know. We will probably never know. And that uncertainty will remain, a persistent reminder of the limits of our knowledge, of the failures of our systems, of the capacity of people to disappear, even in an era that seems designed to make disappearance impossible. Somewhere in Ohio, in the Hancock County Archives, there is a document that says Donald Eugene Miller died on March 23, 1994. That document remains valid, remains official, remains the truth according to the legal system of the state of Ohio. And somewhere else, in a space that no document can capture, there exists or existed a man whose life contradicted that document for decades, whose existence demonstrated that papers can lie, whose final disappearance left a question no one can answer. Two versions of Donald Miller. The official one, dead for decades, definitive in its non-existence. The real one, who lived and fought and eventually faded without a trace. The tension between these two versions is irreconcilable, and the system has no way to accommodate someone who exists and does not exist simultaneously, who is alive according to reality, but dead according to documents. And so Donald Miller remains, suspended between categories, an enigma the system created but cannot solve, a question the documents pose but cannot answer. His case is a reminder that the systems we build to order reality sometimes produce disorder instead. A reminder that the categories we create, alive and dead, existent and non-existent, are more porous than we want to admit. A reminder that in the end, there is always something that escapes the records, something the documents cannot capture, something irreducibly human that no bureaucracy can fully classify. Donald Miller found that space of escape, though not in the way he would have chosen. And in that space he remains, an unanswered question, a mystery that will probably never be solved. There are other cases, less known than Donald Miller's, that illustrate the same systemic problems. In 2011, a woman named Madeline Creedon of Ohio discovered she had been declared dead years earlier due to an error in the Social Security system. Unlike Miller, she eventually managed to correct the error, but only after months of bureaucratic battle that included losing her house because she could not access her own bank accounts. In 2016, a man in Michigan named Aval Melvin Jenkins was arrested for a minor offense and discovered that according to official records, he had died in 1995. He had been living normally for 2 decades, working, paying taxes, not knowing the system considered him deceased. In 2018, a woman in Florida named Shar Day Neal was informed by Social Security that she had died, despite clearly being alive and standing in front of the official, giving her the news. It took her months of paperwork to officially resurrect. These cases, and many others that never reach the media, reveal a disturbing pattern. Administrative death is not a rare aberration, an isolated case occurring once in a million. It is a systemic failure occurring frequently enough to constitute a real problem, though not frequently enough to generate the political pressure necessary for reform. The people affected are generally those with fewer resources to fight the system. They are elderly confused by bureaucracy. They are poor who cannot afford lawyers. They are marginalized people who already have difficulty navigating official institutions. And they are the most vulnerable and therefore the least capable of defending their own rights. Donald Miller had the advantage that his case captured media attention. He had lawyers willing to represent him, journalists willing to tell his story, a public willing to be outraged by his situation. And still he lost. The system refused to correct its error even under the most intense public scrutiny. What happens to those whose cases never reach the media? What happens to the thousands of people who are declared dead by error and who never have the resources to fight that determination? How many people are living right now in some kind of bureaucratic limbo, existing physically but not officially, unable to participate normally in society? There are no reliable statistics on this. The system does not track its own errors this way. There is no database of people erroneously declared dead. No record of how long it takes to correct these errors when they are corrected. No count of how many cases are never resolved. This lack of data is itself revealing. It indicates that the system does not consider these errors a priority problem, does not dedicate resources to measuring or preventing them. They are acceptable collateral damage of a bureaucratic machinery that prioritizes efficiency over precision. The Miller case should have been a wake-up call. It should have generated reforms, new procedures, additional safeguards. Instead, it was absorbed by the news cycle, discussed briefly, and then forgotten. Meanwhile, the system continues to function exactly as before. Courts continue to have the ability to declare living people dead, and statutes of limitations continue to prevent correction of errors after a certain time. Databases continue to fail to communicate with each other in ways that would allow detection of obvious contradictions. And somewhere, probably right now, someone is discovering that according to official records, they have ceased to exist. The Donald Miller story raises a fundamental question. What does it really mean to be a person in contemporary society? In theory, being a person is something biological, something inherent to the human condition. We are people because we are born, because we exist as living organisms, because we have consciousness and experience and the capacity to interact with the world. But in practice, being a person in modern society is also something bureaucratic. We need documents that certify our birth, our identity, our status as citizens. We need numbers that connect us to health, work, and government systems. We need records that demonstrate we exist in the terms the system recognizes. When those documents, those numbers, those records say something different from biological reality, which truth prevails? The Donald Miller case suggests that, at least in some contexts, bureaucratic truth is more powerful than biological truth. A living man was treated as dead because the papers said he was dead. The evidence of his own eyes, of his own physical presence, of his own capacity to speak and argue and exist, was not enough to counteract what the document said. This is profoundly disturbing. It suggests we have created systems that can deny reality, that can impose their own version of facts over observable evidence, and it suggests that documents have become more real than people, that records are more authoritative than bodies. It was not always this way. There was a time not so long ago when a person's identity was established primarily through personal relationships, when being known in a community was enough to establish who you were. Documents existed, but they were secondary to more organic forms of identity verification. The modern world has inverted this relationship. Now, documents are primary. A person can exist in a community for years, can be known by their neighbors, their co-workers, their friends. But if documents say they do not exist, that social existence counts for nothing official. Donald Miller experienced this reality in an extreme way. He had a history, had connections, had people who could testify to his existence. But none of that mattered, because the document said he was dead. This is a form of alienation that Marx did not imagine when he wrote about workers being alienated from the product of their labor. It is an alienation from one's own existence, a separation between biological being and social being, a rupture between the person and the official person that documents say they are. How did we reach this point? How did we build systems that can so completely deny the existence of a living person? The answer is gradual, incremental, unintentional. Each step in the development of modern bureaucracy made sense at the time, solved some problem, increased some efficiency. Censuses helped plan public services. Identity documents helped prevent fraud. Databases helped coordinate services between different agencies. But at some point, these systems acquired an authority no one had planned to give them. They became the definitive source of truth about people, more authoritative than any other form of evidence. Documents stopped being representations of reality and became constitutive of it. Now we live in a world where, for many practical purposes, we do not exist until documents say we exist. And if documents say we have ceased to exist, we cease to exist for all purposes that really matter. The Donald Miller case is an extreme example of this logic taken to its absurd conclusion. But the same logic operates in more subtle ways in the lives of all of us. We all depend on systems recognizing us. We are all vulnerable to errors in those systems. We all exist, in a sense, only because documents say we exist. This is a precarious condition, and it means that our social existence, our ability to participate in society, is always potentially threatened by bureaucratic errors, by system failures, by decisions made by people or algorithms we do not know. Donald Miller discovered this precariousness in the most brutal way possible. One day, he had an identity, a status, a place in the system. The next day, he had officially ceased to exist. And when he tried to correct that error, he discovered the system had neither the capacity nor the will to do so. His story is a reminder of how fragile our position is, a reminder that the systems we take for granted can turn against us at any moment, a reminder that official existence, something most of us never think about, is as important as physical existence for life in modern society. And let us return now to the question that remains unanswered. What happened to Donald Miller after his second disappearance? The last verifiable data places him in Ohio in the years following the 2013 court ruling. He was living somehow, somewhere, navigating as best he could a life without legal status. The details of that life are not documented, lost in the information void that surrounds someone officially non-existent. At some point, probably in the mid-second decade of the 21st century, he became unlocatable. Journalists who tried to follow up on his story found dead ends. Contacts they had lost communication with him. It was as if he had vanished, physically completing the disappearance that documents had decreed decades before. Is Donald Miller dead? There is no death certificate more recent than the one erroneously issued in 1994. There is no burial record, no police report about discovering a body, no official documentation of a real death. But neither is there any evidence that he is still alive. There are no transactions, no address records, no footprints in the information systems that would indicate continued presence. It is a complete silence, a total absence of data. This silence is disturbing precisely because it is what would be expected both if Miller had died and if he had simply stopped interacting with systems that could detect his presence. Both possibilities produce the same result: absence of information. Let us imagine the two possibilities. In the first, Donald Miller died at some point in recent years. Perhaps it was a natural death, the predictable result of aging, and perhaps the stress of living decades on the margins of the system. Perhaps he died alone, somewhere no one knew him well, with no one to report his death to authorities. In this scenario, his body might have been found and processed as that of an unidentified indigent, one of thousands who die each year without anyone claiming their remains. He might have been buried in a common grave, without name, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of the extraordinarily complicated life he had led. Or perhaps his body was never found. Perhaps he died in a remote place, in a rented room whose owner took weeks to notice his tenant's absence. Perhaps the remains were discovered in a state that made identification impossible. In any case, there would have been no one to connect the dots, to recognize that this nameless body was the same man who had appeared in the news years before as the one who could not prove he was alive. The irony of this possibility is brutal. A man declared dead by error, who fought for years to be recognized as alive, finally dying without anyone knowing it, without any document recording his real death. His administrative death would remain as the only official death, while his biological death would remain completely unrecorded. In the second possibility, Donald Miller is still alive. He is over 70 now, an advanced age, but not impossible. He could be living somewhere, perhaps under a different name, perhaps in some community where official documents matter less, perhaps simply maintaining a profile low enough not to generate any detectable trace. In this scenario, he would have learned to live completely on the margins of the system. He would have found ways to survive without the normal transactions that create data trails. Jobs paid in cash, housing without formal contracts, an existence completely off the grid that most of us take for granted. This possibility has its own irony. A man forced into official non-existence might have decided to embrace that condition, make it a way of life. If the system did not recognize him anyway, why bother interacting with it? If he was officially dead, why not live as if he really were, at least for the purposes of official society? There are people who live this way. There are entire communities of people who exist outside registration systems, who trade in informal economies, who keep their lives deliberately invisible to authorities. It is not an easy life, but it is a life. One Donald Miller would have had more reason than most to choose. There is no way to know which of these possibilities is true, and that uncertainty is in some way the most appropriate endpoint for his story. A man who was declared dead without dying, who tried to legally resurrect and failed, who existed for years in a limbo between official life and death, finally disappears into an ambiguity that no document can resolve. There is no death certificate marking his real death, if he has died. There is no emigration record indicating he left the country. There is no missing person report that activates any search process. There is only silence, a silence that could mean anything and will probably never be explained. The children and grandchildren of Donald Miller, if there are any, live with a peculiar inheritance. Their father and grandfather was declared dead when many of them were young, then briefly reappeared to claim his existence, and finally disappeared again, without a trace. How do families process a story like this? How do they explain to children that their grandfather is legally dead, but might be alive somewhere? What mourning rituals are appropriate for someone whose death has never been confirmed, but whose life cannot be verified either? Interviews with Miller's family members reveal a complex mixture of emotions difficult to classify. There is resentment for the original abandonment, for the years of absence, for the trauma his disappearance caused to a family that had to rebuild itself without him. There is a kind of fatigue, the exhaustion of dealing for decades with a situation that defies normal categories of life and death, presence and absence. But there is also, in something resembling compassion. The understanding that, however badly Miller had acted decades ago, what the system did to him afterward was disproportionate. The perception that his story, though it began with his own mistakes, ended up being about something larger than him, about the failures of a system that can destroy lives without malice, simply by following its own rules. Robin Miller, the ex-wife whose petition triggered the original death declaration, has maintained public silence about the case in the years since the 2013 ruling. There are no recent interviews, no public statements, no indications of how she has processed the strange turn her failed marriage's story took. It is understandable. She too was a victim of this story, in different but equally real ways. She was abandoned by a husband, forced to raise her daughters alone, obligated to seek legal resolution to a situation that had no emotional resolution. When her ex-husband reappeared, she was confronted with the reopening of wounds she had believed closed. Her opposition to Miller's legal resurrection was criticized in some media, painted as the action of a vengeful woman who preferred to keep her ex-husband dead rather than allow him to claim his existence. But the reality was more complicated. She had legitimate reasons to worry about the consequences of that resurrection, reasons having to do with financial obligations and legal complications that would affect her own life. The system put her in an impossible position. Defending her own welfare meant opposing her ex-husband being recognized as alive. It was not a position anyone would voluntarily choose, but it was the position the system placed her in. This is another of the cruelties of the Miller case. It not only affected Donald, but everyone around him. The family he abandoned, the ex-wife who had to deal with the consequences, the children who grew up in the shadow of his absence, all were victims of a situation the system created, and the system refused to resolve. Bureaucratic systems tend to see people as isolated individuals, as separate entities that can be classified and processed independently. But people do not exist in isolation. They exist in networks of relationships, in families, in communities. When the system fails one person, that failure propagates through those networks, affecting many more than the documents suggest. The Miller case affected an entire family for generations. It created wounds that will probably never fully heal, questions that will probably never be answered, a family history that defies any coherent narrative. The official archives of Hancock County contain documents related to the Miller case. There is a petition for death declaration filed in 1993. There is a court order signed in 1994. There is a petition for reversal filed in 2013. There is a court decision rejecting that petition. These documents, cold and technical, tell one version of the story. The official version of the story of a man who disappeared, who was declared dead, who reappeared, who was rejected by the system, who disappeared again. The story of a shattered family, of altered lives, of consequences extending across decades. This human story has no official archive. There is no document that captures it in its entirety, that records the pain and confusion and frustration and resignation. Documents only capture administrative facts, dates, decisions, case numbers. Everything else is lost in the spaces between the lines. It is a fundamental limitation of bureaucratic documentation. It can record events, but not experiences. It can catalog decisions, but not consequences. It can create categories, but cannot capture the complexity of the lives those categories supposedly describe. Donald Miller exists in the archives as a case number, as a series of documents, as a court decision that was news for a few days. But the person behind those documents, the human being with a history and emotions and relationships, that person exists in no archive. That person has been lost, first administratively, and then perhaps physically. The late 20th century and early decades of the 21st have seen an explosion in the amount of data that government and corporate systems collect about people. Every transaction, every movement, every interaction leaves a digital trail. We live in what some have called the era of big data, where information about our lives is constantly being recorded, stored, analyzed. In this context, the story of Donald Miller seems anachronistic. How can someone disappear in an era of ubiquitous surveillance? How can systems fail so completely to detect someone who is alive when they declare them dead? The answer is that data systems, however vast, have blind spots. Databases do not always communicate with each other. Algorithms have limits. The amount of information is so enormous that many anomalies go unnoticed. Donald Miller fell into one of those blind spots. His case revealed that the systems that seem omniscient to us have fissures, that the surveillance that seems total to us has gaps, that the documentation that seems complete is full of empty spaces. This revelation is simultaneously disturbing and comforting. Disturbing because it undermines our faith in the systems that supposedly protect and organize us. Comforting because it suggests that individual freedom has not been completely abolished, that there are still spaces where people can exist outside the reach of control systems. Donald Miller found those spaces, though not voluntarily. His life after the death declaration was a life on the margins, in the interstices between systems, in places where documentation does not reach. And his final disappearance was a complete immersion in those spaces. He disappeared so completely that we cannot even know if he continues to exist, if he has found some sustainable form of life on the margins of the system, or if he has died without anyone documenting it. This uncertainty is the most lasting legacy of his case. Not the legal injustice, which was real, but eventually forgotten. Not the media coverage, which was intense but brief. But the unanswered question, the impossibility of knowing, and the mystery that remains when systems have done everything they can do and still have no answers. Ultimately, the story of Donald Miller is a story about the limits of human knowledge. We build systems to track, document, categorize. We create databases and algorithms and bureaucracies designed to know everything about everyone. And still, there are things that escape our knowledge. There are people who disappear without a trace. There are questions that have no answers. Donald Miller is one of those questions. Where is he? What happened to him? Is he alive or dead? We do not know. The systems that should know have failed. The documents that should have the answers are blank or contradictory. There is only silence, the silence of an archive that has no more entries, the silence of a search that finds no results, the silence of a question floating in the air, waiting for an answer that will probably never come. Somewhere, perhaps, Donald Miller exists. He ages, breathes, thinks, feels. Or perhaps not. Perhaps his existence ended years ago, without documentation, without ceremony, without anyone connecting the dots. We cannot know. And that inability to know, that irreducible uncertainty, is perhaps the most profound statement his case makes about the human condition in the information age. We believe we know everything. We believe our systems are complete. We believe documentation is exhaustive. But it is not. It never was. And Donald Miller's story is there to remind us. A man was declared dead by error. He tried to resurrect, and the system prevented him. He disappeared without a trace. That is all we know. And it is probably all we will ever know. The questions remain open. The mystery persists. And Donald Miller, alive or dead, documented or not, remains as a reminder of everything that escapes our systems, everything we cannot control, everything that ultimately remains irreducibly human. His story has no ending. It has only a pause, a silence that could mean anything. And in that silence, we wait for answers that will probably never come. There is a question underlying this entire story, a question we rarely formulate, but that the Donald Miller case forces us to confront. What does it really mean to exist in contemporary society? It is not an abstract philosophical question. It is a practical, urgent question with real consequences for millions of people. Because existence, as we experience it in modern life, is not just a biological fact. It is also a social, legal, bureaucratic fact. And these different types of existence do not always coincide. Donald Miller existed biologically during all the years the system declared him dead. His heart beat, his lungs breathed, his brain processed thoughts and emotions. He was as alive as any of us, in the most fundamental sense of that word. But he did not exist socially. He had no recognized place in the structure of society. He could not participate in the institutions that define modern citizenship. He was a physical presence without institutional correlate, a living body inhabiting a dead identity. This dissociation between biological existence and social existence is more common than we want to admit, Refugees fleeing wars often exist biologically, while their legal identities are lost in the chaos of forced migration. The undocumented who work in developed countries' economies exist as workers, as neighbors, as community members, but do not exist for the official systems that distribute rights and benefits. Donald Miller was an extreme version of this condition. He was not a refugee, not an undocumented immigrant. He was an American citizen born and raised, who had lived his entire life within the system until the system decided he had died. His case demonstrated that social non-existence is not just a problem for foreigners and marginalized people. It can happen to anyone, even to those who thought they had a secure place in the social structure. This universal vulnerability is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. If it could happen to Donald Miller, a white man, American citizen, with no criminal record or particularly extraordinary circumstances, it can happen to anyone. The system has the capacity to erase people, and that capacity is not reserved only for the marginalized and vulnerable. Of course, the marginalized and vulnerable are those who most often experience this destructive capacity of the system. They have fewer resources to fight bureaucratic errors, less access to lawyers and media, less power to force the system to correct itself. Donald Miller had the advantage that his case captured public attention, and still he lost. Imagine all those who face similar situations without any attention, without any resources, without any hope of correction. The modern bureaucratic system is in many ways an extraordinary achievement. It has allowed organizing societies of millions of people, coordinating complex services, distributing resources at a scale that would have been impossible in earlier eras. But like all human achievements, it has shadows. It has the capacity to produce injustices as easily as it produces efficiencies. It has the capacity to destroy lives while following its own rules with perfect consistency. Donald Miller experienced that shadow. He was a victim not of malice, but of indifference, not of corruption, but of procedure, not of bad individuals, but of blind systems. His story is a reminder that the systems that serve us can also turn against us, and that when they do, they can be extraordinarily difficult to resist. The reforms that could prevent cases like Miller's are technically simple. Better cross-verification systems between databases. Review procedures for presumptive death declarations. Exceptions to the statute of limitations for errors that deny the existence of living people. None of these reforms would require fundamental changes to the structure of the legal system. But technically, simple reforms are often politically difficult. They require someone to propose them, someone to advocate for them, someone to put them on the legislative agenda. And cases like Miller's, though they briefly capture public attention, rarely generate the sustained pressure necessary for legislative change. The cycle is predictable. An absurd case makes the news. The public is briefly outraged. Legislators express concern. And then, attention moves to something else. Outrage dissipates. Reform promises are forgotten. The system continues exactly as before, waiting for the next Donald Miller. This system inertia is, in itself, a type of injustice. It is not the injustice of malicious action, but the injustice of persistent inaction. It is the injustice of knowing something is wrong and doing nothing to correct it, of recognizing a problem and leaving it unresolved, of expressing concern and taking no action. Donald Miller was a victim of this injustice of inaction. The system that declared him dead could have had mechanisms to prevent such errors. The system that rejected his resurrection could have had exceptions for such clear cases of injustice. But it did not, because no one had the political will to create them. And after his case, despite all the media coverage, despite all the public outrage, those mechanisms still do not exist. The next Donald Miller will face exactly the same obstacles, the same refusals, the same Kafkaesque impossibility of proving their own existence. This is what makes his story not only tragic, but also political. It is not just the story of an individual trapped in an absurd situation. It is the story of a system with known flaws that refuses to correct them. It is the story of a society that tolerates avoidable injustices because correcting them would require effort and will that no one is willing to invest. Donald Miller disappeared. We do not know where he is or what happened to him, but the conditions that made his situation possible remain intact. The laws remain the same. The procedures remain the same. The possibilities for injustice remain the same. In this sense, his story has not ended. It continues to repeat itself, and in different but structurally similar forms. Every time the system fails, someone refuses to correct that failure. Donald Miller was one of the cases that made the news. But there are many others that never do, that remain invisible, that are absorbed by the system without a trace. Those invisible stories are the true legacy of the Miller case. Not the brief notoriety, not the sensationalist headlines, but the recognition that there is a systemic problem affecting real people in devastating ways. And as long as that problem remains unresolved, as long as the system remains capable of declaring the living dead and refusing to correct its errors, the story of Donald Miller will remain relevant. Not as historical curiosity, but as a living warning about the limits and failures of the systems that govern our lives. His final silence, whether the silence of death or the silence of a life lived completely on the margins, is a testimony to those limits and those failures. It is a reminder that the systems we create can escape our control, can produce results no one wants, can trap people in situations from which there is no escape. And it is a question that remains open, waiting for an answer that will probably never come. Where is Donald Miller? And how many others like him are lost in the spaces between systems, invisible, forgotten, waiting for recognition they may never receive? These questions float in the air, uncomfortable, unresolved. They are the questions the Donald Miller case leaves us, his most lasting legacy, his involuntary contribution to our understanding of what it means to exist in a world of systems and documents. There are no answers. There are only questions. And the silence of a man the system declared dead decades ago, and who then disappeared so completely that no one can say whether he finally died or simply found a way to live without the system knowing. That silence is his monument, and in that silence remains the fundamental question his story poses. What does it mean to exist when existence depends on a system recognizing you? Donald Miller could not answer that question. The system could not answer it. And we, observing from outside, can only recognize that the question exists, that it is important, and that it will probably never have a satisfactory answer. That is all that remains. An unanswered question, an unexplained silence, and the story of a man the system destroyed without malice, following its own rules to produce a result anyone would recognize as absurd and unjust. Donald Eugene Miller, declared dead on March 23, 1994. Disappeared a second time at some point in the second decade of the 21st century. Alive or dead, we do not know, and we probably never will. Some names are remembered for their accomplishments. Others are remembered for their tragedies. Donald Miller is remembered for both, for what he could have been and for what he became, for the wasted potential and for the horror his life transformed into, for the questions he left unanswered and for those he forced us to ask ourselves. He is a reminder of the fragility of the human mind, of how easily one can become lost, of how difficult it can be to find the way back once you start withdrawing from the world. And he is a reminder of our responsibility toward others, that we live in community whether we like it or not, that what happens to our neighbor, even the strange neighbor who never leaves their house, concerns us all. Donald Miller died alone. He died forgotten. He died in ways that could have been prevented if someone, anyone, had decided to act. May his memory serve to make us do things differently. Somewhere in some city, right at this moment, someone is closing their windows. Someone is preparing their disappearance. Someone is withdrawing from the world, step by step, day by day, until the abyss becomes insurmountable. Perhaps it is time for us to stop walking past. Perhaps it is time for us to ask the question. On March 23, 1994, a man was declared legally dead in an Ohio courtroom. It was a routine procedure, the kind that happens every day in courts across America, designed to bring closure to families of the missing, to allow life to continue in the absence of certainty. But Donald Eugene Miller was not dead. He was very much alive, living in another state, breathing the same air, walking under the same sun. The declaration that erased him from official existence was based on absence, not evidence, on silence, not proof, on the assumption that a man who had not been heard from in years must no longer exist. That assumption was wrong, and when Miller tried to correct it, the system that had made the error proved incapable of acknowledging its mistake. This is the essence of bureaucratic tragedy. Not malice, but mechanism. Not cruelty, but consistency. And a system designed to produce predictable results, producing a result no one could have predicted. A result that violated every principle of justice, while following every letter of the law. The reforms that would prevent future Donald Millers are straightforward. Allow exceptions to statutes of limitations for cases where the error is the declaration itself. Require periodic verification before presumptive death declarations become permanent. Create processes for living people to challenge their own death certificates. These are not radical proposals. They are common-sense adjustments to a system that has obvious flaws. And yet, years after the Miller case made international headlines, none of them have been implemented. The system continues as before, waiting for its next victim. The final years of Donald Miller's documented existence were spent in a kind of purgatory. Not dead, not alive, not present in any official sense, not absent in any physical sense. He existed in the spaces between categories, in the gaps between databases, in the silence between records. And then he stopped existing in any documented way at all. Whether he died or simply withdrew further from a world that had denied his existence, we cannot know. The same system that erroneously declared him dead in 1994 provides no record of what actually happened to him. There is no death certificate marking his real departure from life, no missing person report noting his disappearance, no official acknowledgement that anything at all has changed. For the state of Ohio, for the federal government, for every database and archive and record-keeping system, Donald Eugene Miller remains exactly what he was declared to be in 1994. Deceased. The man who fought to prove he was alive has, in the end, been absorbed by the very status he struggled against. There is a kind of terrible poetry in this. A man who could not prove his existence eventually ceased to produce any evidence of it. A man who was administratively dead became physically unlocatable. A man whose life the system refused to acknowledge eventually became truly unknowable. His story ends not with resolution, but with dissolution, not with answers, but with the fading of questions, not with justice, but with the slow erosion of relevance, as the case that once made headlines becomes a footnote, then a trivia question, then a half-remembered anecdote about bureaucratic absurdity. But for those who take the time to consider what happened to Donald Miller, for those who see in his story something more than a curiosity, there are lessons that remain urgent. Lessons about the power of systems over individuals. Lessons about the fragility of the identity we take for granted. Lessons about what it means to exist in a world where existence itself must be certified, documented, approved. We are all, in some sense, at the mercy of the systems that record our lives. We depend on databases to remember our names, on documents to certify our existence, on bureaucracies to acknowledge our place in the world. Most of the time, this dependence is invisible, a background condition of modern life that we never think about. But for Donald Miller, that dependence became visible, became urgent, became the central fact of his existence. He learned what it means to have the system turn against you, to have the records say something different from reality, to be told by the machinery of civilization that you simply do not exist. His story is a warning, a reminder that the systems we trust to organize our lives are fallible, are imperfect, are capable of producing results that defy common sense and basic justice. A reminder that any one of us could, through circumstances beyond our control, find ourselves in a similar position, fighting to prove what should be self-evident, that we are alive, that we exist, that we matter. Donald Eugene Miller may be dead now, or he may still be alive somewhere, existing in the margins, living the unrecorded life of someone the system has forgotten. We will probably never know which is true, but his story lives on as a testimony to the limits of bureaucratic reason, as a reminder of the human cost of administrative error, as a question that haunts the intersection of law and life, of documents and reality, of systems and the people they are meant to serve. Where is Donald Miller? The question echoes in the silence he left behind, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, a reminder of everything we do not know, and may never learn about the lives lived in the shadows of our systems. In the end, that question may be his most lasting legacy. Not the absurdity of his case, not the headlines it generated, not even the injustice he suffered, but the simple, terrible question of what happened to a man the world decided did not exist. Where is Donald Miller? We do not know. We may never know. And in that not knowing, we confront the limits of our systems, the gaps in our knowledge, the irreducible mystery of human existence in an age that claims to have eliminated mystery altogether. That is the story of Donald Miller. A story without ending, without resolution, without the comfort of certainty. A story that continues to be told, waiting for an answer that may never come. The archives of Hancock County, Ohio, hold documents that tell one version of the Donald Miller story. Paper records and digital files, court orders and legal determinations. The official history of a man who was declared dead and who failed to prove otherwise. But there is another history, one that exists outside the archives, one that lives in the memories of those who knew him, in the questions of those who wonder what became of him, in the silence that has settled over his story since he disappeared from view. This unofficial history is fragmentary, incomplete, resistant to the kind of certainty that official records claim to provide. It is a history of absences, of gaps, of things that cannot be documented because no one was there to document them. It is the history of Donald Miller's actual life, as opposed to his official one. The history of a man who existed when the record said he did not, who walked among us when the databases marked him as departed, who breathed and thought and felt while the bureaucracy insisted he was nothing more than a closed file. This history has no ending, because the ending, if there was one, went unrecorded. We do not know if Donald Miller found peace, found community, found any sort of life worth living in the margins, where he was forced to exist. We do not know if his final years were lonely or contented, difficult or manageable, filled with regret or with some measure of acceptance. All we know is the silence that eventually swallowed him, the same silence that had, in a bureaucratic sense, swallowed him decades earlier, when a judge signed an order declaring him dead. But this time, the silence was total. This time, there were no records to contradict, no documents to challenge, no official facts to dispute. This time, Donald Miller simply ceased to generate any evidence of his existence at all. It is a strange form of completion. A man who spent years trying to prove he was alive eventually became truly unknowable, truly unreachable, truly beyond the capacity of any system to find or identify. The administrative death became, in a sense, a kind of truth, not because he was actually dead, but because he had become as invisible, as unrecorded, as officially non-existent, as the documents had always claimed. Whether this was a tragedy or a liberation, we cannot say. Perhaps Donald Miller found freedom in finally accepting the status the system had imposed on him. Perhaps he found peace in withdrawing from a world that had insisted he did not exist. Or perhaps his disappearance was not chosen, but forced. Not a liberation, but a final defeat. Not an acceptance, but an abandonment of hope. We will never know. The answers to these questions, if they exist at all, are locked away in places no inquiry can reach, in memories that may no longer exist, in records that were never made. What we have instead is the story of a man who was declared dead by error, who fought to correct that error and failed, who eventually disappeared into the very non-existence the system had decreed for him. It is a story without resolution, without closure, without the satisfaction of knowing how it ends. But perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps stories like this should not have clean endings. Perhaps the discomfort of not knowing, the nagging uncertainty of an unresolved mystery, is itself a kind of truth, a reminder that life does not always tie up loose ends, that some questions remain forever open. Donald Miller's story is one of those questions, an open wound in the certainty of our record-keeping systems, a gap in the seamless narrative of bureaucratic completeness, a reminder that behind every file, every database, every official record, there are human lives that exceed what documents can capture. His name may fade from memory. His case may become a footnote in legal textbooks, an example cited in discussions of statute of limitations reform. The headlines that briefly made him famous may yellow and crumble, physical and digital, lost to the erosion of time. But the question he posed will remain. The question of what it means to exist when existence must be certified by systems beyond our control. The question of what happens when those systems fail, when they declare us dead or non-existent, when they refuse to acknowledge the simple fact of our being. That question will outlast Donald Miller's story. It will remain relevant as long as bureaucratic systems hold power over human lives, as long as documents can contradict reality, as long as the gap between official existence and actual existence remains unbridged. Donald Eugene Miller, born 1950, declared dead 1994, disappeared sometime after 2013, current status unknown. That is the official summary, the bureaucratic epitaph, the final entry in a file that will never be properly closed. But behind that summary is a life, a complicated, troubled, ultimately mysterious life that exceeded the capacity of any system to fully capture or understand. That life may be over now, or it may continue somewhere, somehow, in forms we cannot document and may never discover. In either case, the question remains: where is Donald Miller? The silence answers nothing, and we are left with only the question, echoing in the space between records and reality, between official truth and lived experience, between the certainty of documents and the uncertainty of human existence. That is the legacy of Donald Miller, not an answer, but a question, not a resolution, but a reminder that we are all, in the end, more than what the records say we are, and a warning that the records sometimes can forget that entirely.